Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us here tonight. Thank you for logging in, for signing up for this very important series, and most important, joining us tonight. My name is Kenya Young. I'm the executive producer of Morning Edition with NPR and the podcast Up First. I'm also a very proud Notre Dame alum, class of 1994. But most important for this evening, I'm pleased to serve as your moderator for this discussion. This is actually the fourth session in Notre Dame's Bridging the Divide speaker series. It's hosted by the Provost's Office in partnership with the Clough Center for Civil and Human Rights and the Rooney Center for the Study of American Democracy. So the aim of this series is to promote thoughtful conversations on important issues as we head to this next presidential election, which, believe it or not, is only 2 weeks away. Some of you may have been talking about this election for the last few days, last couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months. In my case, maybe a couple years now. But regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, I hope one thing we can all agree on is the need to respect the opinion of others if we're going to have meaningful conversations about issues that divide us. We are living in unprecedented times. We're dealing with a pandemic. We have been for months, a few months to go. We have deep political and racial divides within our nation. And we have a presidential election coming up that is almost certain to be contested, regardless of which candidate wins. Now more than ever, it's time for us to wrestle with these difficult topics and difficult issues, but to do so respectfully and with an open mind. So that's the aim of tonight. And the aim of this particular session is to explore women's voting patterns and some of the myths or misperceptions, one might even say assumptions, of the quote unquote woman's vote. So joining us for this conversation are Christina Wolbrecht. She's a professor of political science and director of the Rooney Center of Study, the Rooney Center for the Study of American Democracy at Notre Dame. Christina is also the co-author of A Century of Votes for Women, American Elections Since Suffrage. It's a book that examines how women voted across the first 100 years since the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Also joining us, Dianne Pinderhughes, Notre Dame Presidential Faculty Fellow and Professor in the Department of Africana Studies and the Department of Political Science. Her research addresses inequality with a focus on racial, ethnic, and gender politics, and public policy in the Americas, and the formation of voting rights policy. We're going to have this discussion tonight. We're going to get started with a few questions here that I'm going to kick off. And we also welcome you to submit questions using the tab on the ThinkND page that you've logged into. So Dianne and Christina, thank you so much for joining us. We're just going to kick off and get started. To get us started, I thought I'd ask both of you, based on your backgrounds and perspectives, to share your thoughts and expectations regarding the so-called woman's vote in the upcoming election. Christina, I'm going to start with you. What do you expect to see in the 2020 election, and what have you seen so far?
Thanks, Kenya. I think the first thing I want to say is, and as I always say in these sorts of presentations, is to encourage people to toss away that phrase, the women's vote. There really isn't a woman's vote. Women are as diverse in their ideas and their interests and their identities as men are, and that's reflected in their voting behavior. And so, for the most part, a woman with a college education votes more similarly to a man with a college education than she would to a woman who has less educational attainment. And we can go through all the different groups in that sort of way. That doesn't mean that gender doesn't matter. And the second thing I want to do is make a distinction, and I will credit my colleague Kern McConaughey for this phrase. Women don't vote as a unified sisterhood, but they still vote in ways that reflects their gender. And so, for example, we know that women are, excuse me, we're going to, of course, have technical problems today. That's my first. We know that women are more likely to vote Democratic than men and have been since at least 1980. And I hope that's something we'll have time to get into more today.
To follow up on what you're saying, one of the things we hear a lot, particularly this election, is suburban women. What exactly, I'll ask this of both of you, because it seems like it's such a phrase. As you were saying, the women bloc is one thing. Suburban women seems to encompass something, but I don't quite know what these days. What's the assumption about suburban women and who they are and what that panders to?
Well, thank you, Kenya. Yeah, happy to be here this evening. Well, I think the phrase is often used to suggest or to imply that suburban women are more likely to be European American predominantly. That phrase, however, is no longer accurate in the sense that the suburbs are much more diverse demographically at present than they were 20 to 30 years ago when things were somewhat different. When people talk about suburban women, they may be trying to indicate women who are white in general, and with the expectation that they are perhaps more likely to be Republican, or perhaps more likely to be another phrase that was used in an earlier generation was soccer moms, with a certain kind of expectation of who we're talking about. But I think that phrase is not very useful any longer.
Christina, what about you? What are your thoughts on that?
So I would agree entirely with my colleague Dianne, which is not at all a surprise. There's this sense that when you say suburban women, it's a polite way to say white women. And that's just factually inaccurate. It also sort of focuses our attention where most of our attention is when we talk about women voters, and that's again on white women. And so Dianne rightfully said, when we talk about soccer moms, when we talk about who women voters are, we talk a lot about motherhood. That's very dominant, that they care about health and education. And this sort of language is really powerful. Women who are married and live in the suburbs and have children are not a majority of the female electorate. And to the extent that we focus on these categories like suburban women, that means that our representatives aren't thinking about how to appeal to lots of other kinds of women who might have lots of other kinds of interests and identity. And so I would say it's almost as important who we think women voters are as who they actually are, because if everyone thinks to appeal to a woman voter is to appeal to a white woman living in the suburbs, that has real negative representational consequences for women who do not fit that category.
So to that end, Dianne, your background is in research in race and ethnic studies of this voting bloc. What is the pattern for Black women voting in recent presidential elections, and what do you expect to see this coming 2020 election?
African American women tend to vote heavily Democratic. They have in the last elections for very many years now, probably since the mid-1960s. They voted, I got out an old article I'd written about the Obama election, and something like 96% of women voted for Obama. In 2008. In 2008, 95% of Black men voted for Obama. And that's unusual in the sense that for most elections before then, and actually also for 2016, there's usually a gap between Black men and women voting. In one of the Reagan elections, something like 11% more Black men voted for Reagan than Black women. Generally, in other words, Black women are more likely to vote more heavily Democratic than Black men. I would expect to see in this election that they will vote heavily Democratic for Vice President Biden, and that they will turn out in very high numbers. In fact, in 2012, something like, in terms of the Black white population, a higher proportion of Blacks turned out in 2012 to vote for President Obama. And generally, Black women turn out in higher proportions than men in general. And I expect to see that in this election.
Yeah, Christina, you were saying that earlier as well, that women are more likely to vote Democratic than men are. Why is that? And what are the issues or attitudes that cause that to happen with this gender gap?
So when we think about the gender gap, I think it's very common, and we hear this in commentary all the time, to think about the ways in which the parties are different. As I say to my students, for there to be a gender gap, two things have to happen. Men and women have to have somewhat different opinions or attitudes on some sort of an issue, and the parties have to be distinct on that issue. And when the gender gap in favor of Democrats emerged in 1980, the parties had just really polarized on women's rights issues. The Republicans had taken a pro-life position. They'd removed the Equal Rights Amendment from their platform, and Democrats supported the ERA and took a pro-choice position very strongly in 1980. The truth is, however, that does not seem to be the set of issues that explain why women are slightly more democratic than men are. It turns out men and women actually don't have dramatically different preferences on those sorts of issues. And to the extent they do, it's often that men are actually more pro-choice or more in favor of some of these provisions. Most scholars argue that it's really social welfare attitudes, whether or not you think that the government should be more active, spend more money on health, put more resources into education, to programs for the poor, to addressing civil rights claims, et cetera. The parties have clearly been quite distant on those issues from the New Deal, but particularly since the Great Society programs of LBJ. I'd say one more thing about that. That's often attributed to some sort of sense that women are more compassionate, more caring. These are stereotypes that go back a millennia. But the reality is that women may just be voting their pocketbooks the same as men do. Not only are women more likely to be beneficiaries of social welfare programs, which is how that they're designed when we think about who deserves to have government help, but it's also important to say that women are much more likely to work in the public sector. They're public school teachers. They work in the healthcare industry. They're social workers. Their immediate sort of the sort of economic condition for their family relies in part on government investments in those sorts of positions. So it may be less compassion and more that, like labor unions and lots of other groups that support these sorts of programs, they just see it to be in their and their family's best economic interest.
And Dianne, do you see the same thing with the difference between voting patterns in Black women and Black male voters?
Well, that's a little more complicated because I think you're likely to have a higher proportion of Black women employed than Black men, and higher rates of unemployment among the men than among the women, and which would actually give you the answer yes, because those women are going to be working in public sectors, in education, in schooling, in certainly in social welfare departments, programs, et cetera. And they're more likely, there's a higher proportion of women who are not married and or are the sole household earners. So they're going to be in need of income because they may be not married or not partnered with a person who's also working. So I think that the proportions of employment issues, marriage issues is a lower proportion of women, Black couples that are married in the US than other portions of the population, among Latinos, for example, certainly among Asian Americans. So those issues of economic stability loom very large among Black women, for sure.
Yeah, can I add one thing to that?
Absolutely.
Diane's the expert here, without question. What I think is exciting from someone who looks sort of broadly at women's voting patterns is scholars are increasingly understanding that what causes the gender gap, or what keeps it going in one group, may not be the same as in the other. And so I absolutely think Diane's correct about dynamics in the African American community. There's also great scholarship that shows that Black women tend to have a very strong sense of community and commitment to the community. And when they vote, they're voting for what they think is best for their community as a whole. This is often described as linked fate in political science. We see similar but different sort of patterns in the Latino community, where stereotypical ideas of machismo and some other dynamics seem to be at work there. So I think not only do we have to recognize how different groups of women voters are, but also to recognize that the dynamics within those communities may be different as well.
Yeah, I was actually just going to ask that. Other communities of color, Latino voters, Asian American women, even Indigenous, what are the patterns we see there?
So for the most part, the gender gap persists across racial and ethnic groups, different racial and ethnic minority groups. Certainly among Latinos, but we also see it, although it's more challenging for us to study and we don't always do as good of a job as we can, in, say, Indigenous communities, Asian communities as well. And again, that's fairly persistent. As Dianne rightly said, there are the differences in that. The support in the African American community, for example, for Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012 was really enormous. But in general, we tend to see a Democratic advantage among all these different groups of women of color.
So let's take a little bit of a history lesson here, since we've got such a wealth of knowledge and so much background and research here. We just finished commemorating 100 years women's suffrage. Christina, let's talk about the lessons. Are there lessons from women's suffrage for voting rights today? What are we seeing play out now, 100 years later?
I think there are a ton of lessons. The key one is that voting rights are always contested. And let me try to sort of narrow in on one aspect in particular. When women first got the right to vote in the 1920s, they were almost immediately described as a failure. And what that meant was that women really didn't seem to be taking up their right to vote. And so this long struggle, this huge battle was just not worth it. In our research, we find that about 30% of women, a little bit higher, turned out to vote in 1920 compared to almost 70% of men. So it's a big turnout gap. That has, of course, been reversed since 1980. Women are now, again, across racial and ethnic groups, more likely to turn out than men. We can talk about that as well. But the reality gets more complex if we look at the state level. And it turns out that, and I would say this is true today, the extent to which a group votes is not just a function of their own interest in doing so, but of the context in which they're enfranchised. And so in the 1920s, those laws in the South and in the Northeast that were meant to keep Black people and immigrants from voting, like poll taxes, literacy tests, long registration deadlines, those things held down women's votes as well, and even more than men's. In fact, in the South in the 20s and the 30s, white women organized against the poll tax, not because they were committed to civil rights, but they understood that in their families, if their family could only afford one poll tax, it wasn't going to be the woman's poll tax. And so this continual struggle, I think we see today in our battles over, how many polling places there are, where you can submit your ballot, et cetera. The other thing I'd say about that is we are absolutely commemorating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. But it is important, as so many scholars have pointed out, to realize that, of course, Black women have never stopped fighting for voting rights. The 19th Amendment, I want to recognize lots of Black women did vote, both in the North and in places in the South. It took a whole lot of work and a lot of community effort, but they did. But of course, many of them could not. And so that struggle, really, the 19th Amendment is more of a blip for them, in part of sort of a long struggle for voting rights for the African American community.
Well, Dianne, that's actually where I was going to go next is, what was missed and what either, time, what had to be made up over due time, and in some ways still, how much work may still need to be done. It's been 100 years, but some would say there's a gap there that needs to be covered, that bridged.
Well, so much has been missed in the sense of, the 19th Amendment is passed, but when the legislation was passed or when the amendment was approved by various state governments, state legislatures, the agreement was that there wouldn't be an effort to permit Black women to vote, because Black women voting would blow the agreement and blow the ability of Southern states to control the legislature, control public policy in ways that would just continue to discriminate against Blacks. So the point of legislation from the late 1890s, when Southern states began to change their constitutions in order to make it very, very difficult for African Americans to vote without violating the 13th, the 14th, or 15th Amendments, which emphasized not discriminating on the basis of race. Those Southern states began to put through legislation that made it expensive to vote, that meant you had to read and interpret a state constitution, that you had to pass complicated voter registration laws, all of which, given the unwillingness of Southern states to invest in education, made it very difficult for Blacks to penetrate. So the ability of women to vote didn't change with the 19th Amendment. And, you know, we're having discussions. There's lots of Zoom lectures on these subjects at present. Christina, in particular, has been involved in many of them, and in which it's clear that some Black women did vote, but a very, very small number and small proportion. I would guess, one discussion I heard about 10 days ago, I guess that Maggie Lena Walker, who was the founder of an important Black bank in Richmond, Virginia, I would guess her organization probably assisted in helping people to register and vote at that point. But for the most part, Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, that wasn't going to be permitted. So I don't want to go on too long, but the point is that the NAACP, the Legal Defense Fund, all sorts of organizations worked very hard in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s to begin to try to change that pattern. You start with some changes with the 1957 Civil Rights Act, and then, of course, in the 1960s, the 64 Civil Rights Act and the 65 Voting Rights Act. It took until then that there was at least some legislation reaffirming the right to vote. But even after that, there was still a lot of work that had to be done in order to facilitate voter registration, voter participation, not having state legislatures, Southern state legislatures. You know, you can vote, but you don't get to elect the representative of your choice. So there was a whole series of actions taken through the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s to facilitate that. Now with the decision by the Supreme Court to Holder versus Southern County, thank you. The protection of the Voting Rights Act is no longer in place. And so there's no intervention on the part of the Department of Justice to monitor changes in voting laws. So we've seen a lot of Southern states and Western states, Texas in particular, and so forth, move very, very, very quickly to put restrictions on, change the law again, so that it becomes more difficult to and discourages Blacks from voting, which is part of what we're seeing in terms of the run up to this election. All of the changes we're seeing, you can only, you know, in Texas, you can only deposit your vote, your mail ballot in one location in the entire county. Harris County evidently is, you know, you have to drive hundreds of miles in some cases. So lots of problems.
Well, that's one thing I was going to ask with the work that's been done. And let me just interrupt here for those of you listening and participating. We'd love to get your questions. Submit on the Think ND tab. In about 10, 15 minutes here, I'm going to try to toss the questions. So keep the questions going so we can keep the conversation going. I've got tons of them in my head, but this is about you guys. So Christina, one thing I wanted to ask, actually of both of you, in fact, you know, obviously with the movement and the organized actions that women had to take, both in the beginning and throughout the whole 100 years to keep it moving and have some progress. What organizations were born out of that we're still seeing, I guess, results or productivity out now in the current elections? How did organizing create what we're seeing now as far as political action and political, I guess, participation?
So I love this question because it lets me talk about one of the things I love talking about, which is that in some important ways, women really invented interest group politics. And what I mean by that is that in the 19th century, political conflict really happened between political parties. And if you wanted your side to win and get your people elected and change policy, then you organized voters. And so there was no government printed ballot. The parties printed their own ballot. And your job was to have people at every polling place giving people their ballot and a dollar bill or a shot of whiskey or whatever it was going to be to sort of get them to vote. I show in class the list of all the alcohol that George Washington ordered when he ran for his first position in Virginia. That's true. Much more than you would think a county of that few people would actually need. Women couldn't do that. They couldn't organize voters because they weren't voters, right? And so how are they going to change political outcomes if they can't? I mean, certainly they can try, and there's lots of suffrage cartoons of them pulling and kissing the man and all that sort of fun stuff, but they can't really organize voters in the same way. And so what women did is they pioneered different ways of affecting both election outcomes, but also public policy making. So they gave lots of public speeches and where they, and handed out tracts where they talked about their views and tried to make arguments. They had rallies and did protest actions. Women were the very first people to protest in front of the White House. That had never happened until the 19-teens when suffragists stood in front of the White House with those famous banners. They also did a lot of work on direct lobbying. They couldn't elect the people, but they could make appointments to go see them, bring them a little pie or some bread, and talk to them about why women's suffrage was important. They also got into coalition. They couldn't control voters, but other people did. And so in many states, they worked with third parties. They worked with different progressive organizations, with the Populist Party, with the Prohibition Party, with temperance, you name it, building those coalitions. What those coalitions wanted from women, and here I'm drawing directly from my friend Corinne McConaughey's work again, is their good organizational skills. Everybody knows if you want to get something done and organized, you call some women. And what they got from collaborating with these other organizations is their power at the ballot box, right? That members of the Grange or the people who voted progressive would support women's suffrage. Much of that has lasted, that commitment to coalition, that sort of innovating and using gender in new and different ways to try to have political influence. The most obvious example is that the National American Women's Suffrage Association reformed itself as the League of Women Voters in summer 2020 when it was clear that we were going to have the ratification. And the League of Women Voters, as everyone knows, continues to be the leading nonpartisan organization for voter registration, education, and mobilization in the United States.
Dianne?
I mentioned Maggie Lena Walker before. She created an organization called the Independent Order of St. Luke. That was a group that was both males and females, but involved interest in social welfare and participation. There were lots of different ways in which African-American women participated, meaning different types of activities. So you have something like the National Council of Negro Women that was founded in the early 20th century, late 19th century. There are lots of women's organizations that are based in local areas, cities, towns, and so forth. Church women, women involved in churches that are often not the leaders of the churches. They couldn't be the ministers. They couldn't sit on the altar, but they were frequently the people who did a lot of the organizational work. These are also the same people who organized many activities in the core of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. There's a phrase by a wonderful historian, men led but women organized, describing the work that they did in managing the civil rights movement, which is some of the same type of work that they did. I'd be in serious trouble if I did not mention the sororities and fraternities, but particularly the sororities, the women's organizations, the so-called Divine Nine that began to be founded in the early 20th century. They're very active in civic activities and very active in political organizations. They are, Senator Biden picked a member of one of those organizations, so they're very much involved in supporting Kamala Harris as she runs for the Democratic nomination or on the Democratic ticket for vice president. So a combination of types of organizations, religious organizations, social clubs. The club women's movement is the phrase that I was not coming up with, but was looking for, that of which there are many founded in the late 19th, early 20th century. And those organizations really form the foundation for the Urban League and the NAACP. Mm-hmm. When you look at the way those organizations function, it's the women who are doing a lot of that work. And whether it's in club women's activities, whether public policy issues in the local areas as Blacks begin to move to northern cities in large numbers and provide and generate a lot of conflict because people are not happy to see these large numbers of African Americans migrating from the South who are not necessarily used to living in urban areas, and people feel that they need to be taught how to be appropriate in their behavior and so forth. That was a lot of what the Urban League talked about. So there are a lot of different approaches. Elsa Barkley Brown, the historian at University of Maryland, talked about how after the Civil War, women could not vote after the 15th Amendment was passed, but they had conventions, often in churches, and formed discussions between the men and the women about what policy positions the community should take. And they accompanied their husbands and family members to the polls. They made it a family activity, and they went with the commitment to make sure that their husbands were protected from being attacked by the Klan, by people who were opposed to their participation. So lots of different activities. And we see a lot of those organizations in that same type of commitment even now, really.
Now, one thing that we've seen, and this is, I'm going back to the mid-year elections, but, we have Kamala Harris on the ticket this time around for a historic nomination. We've had a few of those historic nominations in the past recent presidential elections. But with the last congressional election, actually, I believe we've got the largest class of women who've been elected in. And I'm wondering where do you see that coming from? Is that a matter of access? Is it a matter of a change of culture in our country? Is it a matter of women just in general feeling like they should be more politically active? Where did that drive come from, do you think, in 2018, that there was such a large class that was elected in?
I'm really glad you asked this question, and I'm going to control myself and not pick up my PowerPoints, because this is what we discussed in my women's suffrage class today. Why women do and do not. I mean, if you guys want me to, it's like a 75-minute lecture, so you can all just sit down and I'll be ready to go. So you were absolutely correct, of course, that 2018 was a historic number of women running for office and a historic number of women voting. One of the things, of course, to say about 2018 is, though, that historic nature was not equal across the parties, but in fact, many, many more Democratic women ran for office in 2018 than did Republican women. That's actually not a new pattern. Since 1992, the first year of the woman, for those of us who recall, Democrats have fielded more women candidates and have more women elected officials. One of the things I'm watching in 2020, however, as we again have a very large number of women running, in part because many of those women, of course, elected in 2018 are running for retention again in 2020. But we have also what is, last I saw, either ahistoric or nearing a historic level of Republican women running for office. Still not at the same level as Democratic women, but we are seeing more. The general take on 2018 is that this was a lot of women who, frustrated with the outcome of the 2016 election, channeled that frustration into political activism, first in the women's marches and then in running for office. And there certainly seems to be some truth to that. We also know, though, that the willingness of women to run depends in part upon how welcoming that system is, the parties, the media, the press, et cetera. We've definitely seen on the Democratic side that at least within primaries, there seems to be a preference for women, that Democrats would like to nominate more women. We don't have a lot of evidence that that's happening on the Republican side. Two more things I would want to add. One is simply that it's also important to note that the biggest barrier to women being better represented in legislatures is that there are men already sitting in those seats. Incumbency is incredibly powerful. Most incumbents win. It is not at all a coincidence. I just showed this graph today that we had one of the highest ever number of open seats in 1992, the last year of the woman, and in 2018, the most recent year of the woman. So it's really hard to unseat incumbents. It happens, but it's really hard. And when more seats, when there's more turnover, that's more opportunity for women to be elected. I will say, however, that we have very little evidence that being a woman is to anyone's advantage in a general election. Why? And that's mostly attributed to the fact that partisanship outweighs everything. Nobody says, I don't usually vote for that party, I don't agree with them on policy issues, I don't support their values. Oh, but they nominated a woman, I guess I'll vote for her now. And vice versa. That's on either side of the bar, which is why we did not, for example, see a particularly large gender gap in 2016.
Dianne, did you have anything to add? I would say, I guess the same was true for not only representatives of color, but women of color, but representatives of color as well in 2018.
Absolutely. I forgot to print out my chart with the numbers, but there's significant numbers of Black women who ran and were elected in 2018. That was quite interesting. I mean, women and men, in the sense that more people were running in districts that weren't necessarily majority Black districts. They were running in multi-ethnic districts. Ayanna Pressley in Massachusetts, for example, the woman from Connecticut who was a teacher ran in a district that was relatively a low proportion of Blacks, and in that district there were a large number. Lauren Underwood, who ran in a district northwest of Chicago that's maybe 88% white, also won election in that kind of district. In the past, people would be more likely to be elected if they were running in a majority Black district, but many people won and ran for office and won in these districts that are much less minority, quote unquote, mixed minority or majority Black than was the case. And it was interesting because I had a chance to look at all of them recently, and it was a very striking pattern, a different pattern than I'd seen in the past.
So I'm going to start to transition to some of the audience questions, participant questions, and I think it'll continue to spur a conversation. Dianne, this first one's for you. This is a question out of Orange County, California. With all the richness and diversity among women voters, why do you think that the political narrative or discourse is so one-dimensional as it relates to earning that woman's vote? It's a great question.
One-dimensional in terms of earning the vote. Well, you could argue it has something rather to do with expectations of how women function in the society and what their interests are. That women's interests are about reproductive issues, about childcare issues, and that's kind of it. When in fact, there's a whole range of issues that would be that have to be important whenever you think about the women's vote: education, advancement, employment issues, how you're able to take care of your family in terms of what kinds of nutrition is available to them, and what appropriate kind of nutrition is made available based on what kind of policy is implemented by government agencies. Environmental issues, clean air. How much does it cost for you to get to work? Can you do it by driving? Do you have to do it by driving? Can you do it by public transportation? There's a whole range of things that are policy issues that affect the ways in which women function. And it tends to be the case that we tend to narrow the orientation in terms of what it is that people think is important for women. That's one answer. I studied women to some extent in recent years in terms of elected officials, but I've not made that the core of my research. So I know I'm going to hand it off to Christina, because I know she'll have some excellent comments about this question, which is a good question.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Christina, this goes a little bit back to when we first started about some of the misperceptions and assumptions made about what women care about. And I don't think I'm talking out of turn for women to say that we care about the economy. We care about healthcare. We care about the same issues that affect daily life, I believe, that men do. And there aren't quite, I think there's this misnomer that's what created this gender gap that you talked about earlier, about what women's issues are and what men's issues are. And the truth of the matter is, certainly the largest ones right now, COVID and the pandemic, as you mentioned, Dianne, education, these are vastly important to women. And it may be underestimated when it comes to, and so to this question, that's not how it's catered to, though, when you're talking about women's voting and trying to get their vote.
So, and I'm sorry to say this, Kenya, but I've made a lot of mileage out of criticizing the press for how they talk about women.
Hey, we're used to it.
but not you, never you. And politicians, et cetera. So this goes back from the very beginning. This is in the first election in 1920, the candidates talked about equal pay. Yes, we've been talking about equal pay for 100 years. They talked about child welfare. They talked about all the things they thought women would care about. When Truman was asked how to do better with women, he said, well, as a woman, as the mother votes, there goes the nation, right? This sort of focus on women as mothers is having very specific interests related to their gender specifically. Where I think I need to give politicians and the press a break, as difficult as that is for me, is there's this sense that if you ask, are women voters different, you're going to focus on what makes women different, right? But of course they care about the economy. Of course they want their family to have food, et cetera. But if we're trying to understand women voters and why they're different, we're going to focus on these issues. But as I've said, the reality is that while they may care more about those issues, both men and women overwhelmingly care about the very issues you were just talking about. The state of the economy. Is our country at war? Do I have good health care? Can I get a good job? Those sorts of questions. The reality, however, is that women are differently placed in the economy. And so they are more likely to be unemployed. They're more likely to have fewer resources, less wealth. They're more likely to bear the demands of care work, children, sick relatives, elderly parents, et cetera. They are not evenly distributed across all professions and all sorts of levels of education, although women, of course, are now, on average, more likely to be college educated than men. And so because they're sort of differently situated, their evaluations of the economy, of what's best for my family, of where they want to see government do more or less, or what rights they want to see government protect or not, is on average slightly different than men's. And that's really where we see sort of the gender differences. And so I think that nuance is the piece that it's a little harder for the press and politicians. They haven't been so great about articulating that. Men and women care about the same things and they vote on the basis of the economy and foreign policy, but they are differently situated on average from men in terms of those important issues.
I'm going to take a question here from Granger, Indiana. Christina, I think this is tossed to you. Do you think or expect there to be trends in voting turnout among women in certain groups, different demographics, and compared to men in taking advantage of the early voting, absentee voting, versus voting on the election day in person? We're already starting to see, obviously, I think the last number I got was 23 or 28 million have voted in early voting. We're already seeing record numbers standing on lines in certain areas. I believe Florida just started their early voting today. It's rolling out throughout the country, and it's quite historic, I think, obviously, for the moment we're in. What are you seeing in the voting patterns for women in this, but also other voting patterns, particular to this very strange election in the middle of a pandemic, as you were so challenged and complicated ways of both campaigning and getting out?
So I love that question. Let me start by saying that white women have the highest turnout of any group in the United States, except for the few elections in which they are surpassed by Black women. And this has been the case. Black women's turnout has been so incredibly high for at least 20 years now. Women in general have been more likely to vote than men since 1980. I do want to point out, however, because there are more women of voting age, we don't die. There have been more women voting in presidential elections since 1964. So even when our rate of turnout was a little lower, there were just so many more of us that there were still more of us voting, right? So women are the majority of the electorate. The fact that women turn out at such high rates, which I absolutely expect to see again in 2020, is a great challenge to the way we usually think about voting, which is this is something people that have more resources do, more education, it's associated with all these things. Women have made gains in many of those sorts of resources, but they still lag behind. And so it seems that for women, the sense of duty, the sense of commitment to the community seems to be explaining that difference, why women's turnout is so very high, which suggests it could only even go higher.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about absentee voting this year and all these other forms of voting, in general, and I say this as a native Oregonian, where there's been vote by mail for more than 20 years now, in general, there's not a lot of evidence that those sorts of provisions actually increase turnout. Why would that be? Because in general, the people who want to vote are going to find a way to vote. It's also the case that voting is a very social act. And there's something about everybody going on a day, everyone's talking about it, people are posting to social media. Your partner says to you in the morning, don't forget to vote this morning. You go to work and people are wearing I voted stickers. All these things sort of cue people to remember, this is something I want to do. And often we aren't able to do those things as clearly with absentee and mail-in voting. I'm making huge generalizations here. There's definitely variation there. I think 2020 is different. I think it's different in a couple of ways. One is in terms of social media. We're seeing those long lines. We're seeing people, I don't have to go to work anymore because who goes actually into work, right?
Yes.
But I see my colleagues and my friends posting their standing in line photos, their pictures,
Their sticker.
Their stickers, exactly. I can't tell you, I think all of my, I don't have a random sample of friends. All of my friends are posting pictures of themselves in front of ballot boxes and those sorts of things. Apparently, if I'd gone Friday morning, I could have voted with Mayor Pete Buttigieg, but that did not work out, et cetera, et cetera. Which I think is giving that same social pressure over a longer period of time, right? What you want to avoid with mail-in voting is, oh, I'll do it tomorrow. Oh, I'll do it tomorrow. Oh, crap, the election actually ended on this day, right? And the problem of federalism is every state has different dates and when can you mail it by and where can you drop it off? All of that complexity is not great for voters and not great for turnout. But there are lots of groups that are putting a lot of energy into trying to solve that complexity. Last two things, then I'll stop talking. One is I am intrigued by the extent to which voter suppression is now having a certain backlash, that at some point you make so many hurdles that it becomes a point of pride and expression. Voting is a ritual in which we reaffirm that we are citizens of this country. It is a secular ritual. And as it becomes, anytime someone tries to take something away from you, you fight harder for it. I stood in line for 4 hours in the heat to vote. That's how committed I am to this democracy. It comes to mean more in lots of ways. And I think that's incredibly important. Lucky for you, I forgot my second point, so we'll come back to it later.
Well, Dianne, that does bring me to a point that I wanted to bring up, and there's a couple of questions here along these lines, and I'll kind of merge them together. But are we seeing parts of the country? You mentioned Texas and Harris County. Are we seeing parts of the country that are at risk for disenfranchisement for women voters? And how concerned are either of you about access to voting rights, whether in some ways for women, but in general right now for this upcoming election?
Access to voting rights for the possibility of disenfranchisement for women, I don't necessarily see that category as vulnerable, although the fact is, given the complexities of and the variation in the ways in which the states have put into place challenges, barriers, things that didn't exist before, I suppose you could make an argument that women are bound to be caught up in some of that. However, the point that Christina just made about the barriers produce a backlash in which people are committed to making sure that they do actually get to vote, convinced that they're going to be able to do it, figuring it out. We've been hearing for the last month or so, plan your vote. How are you going to do it? When are you going to do it? What day? Know what the procedures are in your local jurisdiction. Voting officials around the country have a national organization for managing these processes, and they put on a panel themselves, which I was invited to be a moderator about a month ago, and talking about what kinds of things they would want to do and how they would share information about the voting process and about how complex the voting process is. A, B, that people should not expect that the results would necessarily be known on election day, that it will take longer to count the votes than would normally be the case because of how many vote by mail ballots there are, depending upon when they can begin to count them, et cetera. So in a lot of ways, people have been preparing the electorate for the fact that it's a different election and they shouldn't expect the outcomes that have been the case in the past. Access to voting rights, I think that is going to be a concern in the sense of Shelby County versus Holder having no longer the protection of Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, so that the Congress is unlikely to pass legislation that reaffirms the act at this point. And even if they pass it, it's not going to pass the Senate, in this Senate. So access to voting rights is an issue. It is an issue in the sense of its impact on Black voters. Mm-hmm. I won't say, and it affects Black women voters. It doesn't necessarily affect white women voters, but if the barriers are complex enough, it affects the entire population. And so it's not as if it's something that you could just sort of say, well, it's only affecting Black or Latino or Asian American voters. I think it's a broader problem, and it's something that perhaps can be addressed if the results or the predicted results of this election affect the proportion of Democrats in the House and the proportion of Democrats in the Senate, and perhaps the holder of the presidency. It may make a difference.
Christina, you've talked about, this is a question from, I don't know the location, but from Hannah. You've discussed the strength of women voters, but how much of the infrequent or the unlikely voter population is made up of women? And what are the effective strategies in mobilizing them? And then I have a follow-up question of my own afterwards as we close out.
So that is a great question. And I have been doing suffrage talks for 6 months straight, and I don't think anyone has asked me that question. So thank you, Hannah. That I love it when I get a question I haven't really thought about. Here's the problem with the under-mobilized part of the population that is less likely to vote. And this includes, they're also less likely then to be partisan. So the stronger your sense of partisanship, the more likely you are to show up and, in a sense, root for your team. The portion of the population that's undecided or doesn't pay attention and doesn't show up in elections is obviously large and somewhat diverse. I don't know, although honestly, my guess would be that there would be more men in that group than there would be women, just knowing what I sort of know. This is an incredibly difficult group for politicians and parties to reach, because almost by definition, they're not paying attention. I always say to my students, normal people do not stay up all night watching the debates or come to Notre Dame and take political science classes. Normal people play video games. They, watch a lot of Netflix. They hang out with their families. They cook, they listen to music, they do all sorts of other things. And that is especially true of this population. These are people that pay a lot less attention to politics. They're less knowledgeable about it. I think this very educated audience would be shocked when I told you what percentage of people cannot accurately describe which party is pro-choice and which party is pro-life. That's simply true. They're less knowledgeable, they're less informed, and they just don't care as much about politics. They're not interested in it. So your problem as a party and as a candidate is not only to convince them to vote for you when they don't really care or want to pay attention, but to get them then to turn out on election day. So we see candidates taking sort of different strategies, right? How much do you want to rev up your own base, make sure your people show up on election day, versus how much are you trying to maybe not get the other party's people to switch to you, but to be so little enthusiastic that maybe they just don't bother to vote. There are long lines. I'm not that enthusiastic. I'm not going to show up. That's a very powerful outcome for political parties, right? And so we talk a lot about swing voters in the middle. There's not a ton of them, and they're very difficult to reach and to affect.
So we are going to start to wrap up here. I think, I don't know if I get a countdown, but I think by my clock, we're wrapping up on our hour here.
Yeah.
I hope it's an hour. Someone tell me if it's not. I could keep going. But I just have one final question for each of you. And that is, we've talked about current, we've done some modern history in the 80s and 70s and 80s, and obviously the long-term history of the 19th Amendment. What more needs to be done? Where does modern day women's suffrage go now? Mobilize, you just talked about mobilizing. Christina, are we done?
We're nowhere close to being done. So the Constitution, the original Constitution says almost nothing about voting rights. It really leaves those to the states. There are 3 amendments, the 15th, the 19th, and the 24th, that say what are the categories on which you are not allowed to discriminate. The 15th is race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The 19th is sex. I think I would know that one. The 24th gave the right to vote to those who are 18 and older. The Constitution, however, does not include an affirmative right to vote. And in terms of amendments to the Constitution, this is one that I would favor the most strongly. You can't discriminate on the basis of sex, but there's no obligation on behalf of states, counties, or municipalities to ensure access to the ballot. And that's what an affirmative right to vote would do. to say, we go door to door to make sure people are signed up for the census, that they're being counted for the census. What can we do to eliminate barriers? If it's hard for people to get access to education because of disability, there are programs to help them. What should states be doing to ensure that disabled people can vote? What should states be doing to ensure that people in rural areas who live far away from voting places are able to vote? What should states be doing to ensure that people with less education, with less access to resources, et cetera, are able to vote? And so I think these sort of negative, you can't discriminate, have been incredibly important. But I think the next is to really change the way that we think about voting in the United States as something that the government has the responsibility, not just to not stop Black people and women from voting, but to actually ensure everyone who should and can is able to cast a ballot.
Great. I think we've got about 1 more minute here, Dianne. No problem. Dianne, any final thoughts before I close this out?
Yes, my final thought is on voting rights politics and the tensions that arose after the Civil War and the passage and the debate over passage of voting rights was between white women and Black men. White women felt they should not have to vote after Black men. Eventually, the voting rights 65, the Civil War, 15th Amendment was passed, 19th Amendment was passed. What I think needs to happen at present is for the tensions that remain between women of color, between and among women of color, needs to be addressed. What kinds of issues, what kinds of challenges do we still face and differences do we have? And how can we talk with each other about these issues? And I know I'm out of time.
Well, thank you guys so much. This has been, I think, a very productive evening, a fruitful evening. I'm so glad to have been a part of it. Christina, Dianne, I thank you for your time and your participation and your wisdom. I hope I speak for whoever's out there that this has been so informative and a great 4th session. They've got a fifth session coming up. We hope you can join us again. It won't be me, but us writ large, the Notre Dame series, Wednesday, October 21st at 8:15. That's the next event in this series. That's going to feature Notre Dame alum Ann Thompson. Oh, Ann, from NBC News. We'll speak with former South Bend mayor and presidential candidate Pete Buttigieg about rebuilding trust in America institutions. That's obviously been a big issue in this race all along. For more information on the Bridging the Divide speaker series, visit provost.nd.edu. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for registering. Thank you, Notre Dame, for having us and for putting on this very important, very thoughtful, and very significant series in this moment right now.
Thank you.